Chelsea versus Tottenham, the run-in for Champions League football is about to begin, and in today's video, we're going to be checking out how it all could look against Tottenham. Before we get onto the tactics board, I'm just going to show you a few images so you can see how it looks on the pitch as well, seeing this sort of 3-3-5, but more in a 2-3-5 if you take away the goalkeeper. This is how Tottenham look to set up on the ball with those two inverted fullbacks and that 5 across the front line. One key thing to mention about this is Arsenal tried to keep both of their centre-backs on Solanke in this instance. This is something I don't think Chelsea will do, but we're going to touch on that when we get onto the tactics board. Out of possession, not much has changed for Tottenham. It's still that sort of 4-1-4-1 shape. However, the tendencies that they do from within this press have slightly tweaked in certain games, which again is something we're going to speak about how Chelsea can exploit. The two ways we're going to speak about how Chelsea can exploit this 4-1-4-1 press in their build-up is finding those two pocket players, but also finding the soft spot of Spurs' press, finding that middle point to then exploit and expand from within. So as you can see, another example here against Manchester City. Okay, now let's have a little look on the tactics board and just talk through a few of the things that could happen in this game. Again, we've looked at a few images to start off this video about how Tottenham could look to set up against Chelsea, how to sort of stifle their build-up, and also how they might build up on the ball. Now, just to quickly say, whilst I'm recording this, Kulusevski, as far as I know, he's he's out, but that could be different because I'm recording this a few days before the game. So when the the press conferences happen, you'll have that more information when you're watching this video, because this is probably going to go out on Wednesday, I believe. So let's talk about sort of how it could look. Now, again, 3-2-5, 3-2-4-1, that's probably how we're going to be looking. Chelsea with the likes of Maresca, Jackson, Palmer, all back in training. Lavia could play this one, although I have seen a few bits about him also being out, or at least somewhat risky. So he would have been important in this game, but it looks like he might not feature. But the reason he could be important in this game is a little bit to do with the reasons that we were looking through those pictures at before, is how Tottenham look to press in this sort of 4-1-4-1. If we sort of draw a few lines here, let's use red. What we often see is these players, these wide players, look to jump onto the wide centre-backs. They stay quite narrow, and then they look to either jump onto the wide centre-back, or if the ball is on this side of the pitch, say with Fofana, Cucurella will be left open, and because Basuma will probably be edging this way, then you have Johnson, this sort of winger, who will drop into this sort of half-space player and try and stop that pocket player receiving the ball, if that is sort of, if they're shifting towards this side of the pitch, like such. So these wingers have these sort of dual responsibilities. And now that I think about it, I think this is probably quite a key thing that we spoke about in the last time that we played Tottenham, because it hasn't really changed in terms of how they press. And in terms of how Chelsea will look to exploit this, I think it will very much come down to, can you find one of these players open? And again, more likely, it's going to be starting on this right side, shifting it between this right wing so that Johnson has to cover both Cucurella and Enzo. If then Cucurella can bring the ball forward himself, brilliant, to commit Johnson. Or if we can find Enzo and he can turn and we can attack that back four of Tottenham, then brilliant. Now, another factor when it comes to this is, again, these two players are really important. Let me put this to these two midfield players and sort of attracting that pressure in the pivot. And that's why Lavia could have been really important in this game, because the main change that I've seen from Spurs this season, the few times that I've watched them since, and again, when doing some like analysis for this game, is where they used to be very aggressive, and every single time they would almost play with that 4 very aggressively sort of stretched up. So like I say, here was almost a 5v5 because of how aggressive Spurs were in there, which would again leave this sort of 5v5 here, and you wouldn't be able to always find the overload unless one of these two pocket players would drop in, which is something that Chelsea do a lot anyway. But what I think Spurs started to change as they started to get sort of picked off and played through with players, with teams starting to find one of these two pocket players fairly easily in comparison to what they had been. Can't get rid of that. They've started to be a little bit more cautious with how often they jump that man up. They still do it very often in terms of having both players jump up, but sometimes it will be sort of, you'll almost see one drop off and it almost becomes a bit of a 4-2-3-1 even in the press. So you'll have, if the ball's on this side of the pitch, Maddison will sort of latch onto this player, which then leaves sort of Solanke, who's got this double coverage. This allows Bergvall to drop off, and again, he's in that double coverage zone. Basuma is in a bit of a double coverage zone if James gets past this man. And it just leaves a lot of sort of pressing triggers open, because this is where you can sort of exploit them with carries, which again is so important, having someone like Wesley Fofana back to sort of exploit those carries. But also, if you can find the soft spot, this is how I like to look at it. If you're pressing, let's put it into sort of a hexagon. I think I showed something a little bit like this. Say Maddison's pressed out here because Tell's gone to press inside, so Maddison's then gone to pressure out here. A lot of teams in that sort of 4-2-4, you'll see this hexagon form a lot. Now we'll draw this. You'll see often, this is something Liverpool do, this is something Arsenal do. A lot of teams sort of form this little hexagon around the pivot. Now, obviously, these two players are trying to stop that ball going into the pivot from this angle. You've got these two players trying to stop it going in from here. But if you can find your way into the soft spot of this zone, once you get the ball, and again, I think I showed an image of this for the Arsenal game where they sort of broke into Spurs' soft spot during that time. What you then have is these players then have to collapse inward, because that's the only way to apply pressure on the ball. And because they've already dropped off, you might end up with 2 or 3 players sort of confused on whose man it is to sort of drive in. So then you end up having a few sort of secondary movements that can cause a little bit of a collapse in the defence, which then allows you to find these sort of spare men on the outside of the block. So again, if we say Enzo's one of them, Kukurea might be pushed out here, he might be one of them. Jackson again, if these 2 players push in, then of course there's a lot of space in here to exploit. And again, then these guys can start to stretch with runs in behind. There's so much you can do like this. Once you find the center of that sort of the soft spot of that press when they're in that hexagon shape to make them collapse inwards. So I think that's another important factor. And like I say, I think where they were slightly more aggressive at the start of the season, it would be more so to sort of play round the press. In this game, I think it will sort of alternate between the two, at least from what I've seen recently with the likes of Bergvall and say Basuma or Sarr or Bentancur, because this could be some different personnel. But I think they've all got those aggressive traits where it could change between whether they both go aggressive and they look to, like I say, Johnson then might have to drop off and you find a different sort of way to work around that pressing scheme. Or we see, again, like I say, that sort of hexagon shape form or that 4-2-3-1 shape form when it becomes a little bit more about finding your spare man inside that hexagon, which will often be one of your pivot players. So if I was to predict Caicedo and James in the middle of the park tomorrow, this could very much well be how Chelsea look to go and sort of look to exploit by having one of these guys pick up the ball. Because again, both very technically proficient, can both play on the inside of a press, can both play through the press, can both sort of stretch it with longer balls over the top, can both carry the ball through the middle of the pitch. There's a lot that these two can do if they do find themselves in the middle of that press, allowing Enzo Palmer to sort of stretch those half spaces and Jackson to sit up front. So that is sort of what I think we're going to see. Let me know any questions you have down below. Again, for the pressing routine, I don't think there's too much to go over other than what we spoke about at the start, with Spurs sort of setting up in that almost 2-3-5 with a very sort of the 2 pocket players quite deep and the 3 players really stretched to make sure they pin our back line. I do think that it will be an interesting battle between whoever stays central centre back, so say Colwill on Solanke, because that will often be a 1v1. So I think that's an important thing to watch, because I don't think with the likes of Tell on Fofana, Maddison in the middle of the park, Johnson on Kukurea, I do think we're going to end up leaving that as a 1v1 rather than having that 2v1 that Arsenal had against Solanke. Apart from that, I think a lot of it will be very clear. I think with these 2 players, when they push up on the ball, I think there'll be a lot of space to exploit in behind with Madueke and Neto on the break. So hopefully we can actually look to use that now that we've got those sort of quicker players in behind. Be a little bit more direct when we have the chance to, not at all times, because we need to try and control the game and manage the game. But if we can look to hit them on the break when the chance arises, because of that pace and because these players will step up into those inverted zones, then perfect. That's definitely something you want to look to do as well, not just to exploit the spacing behind left by these 2, but also two players that have struggled from injury. So make them run, make them sort of give them a hard time, test them, because it's worth testing them. Like Van de Ven, this could be his first game back, I'm pretty sure. Ramirez played a few games, but just see what you can do. Try and test that resolve whilst being in control of the game and sort of keeping the variety there. Any questions, as always, let me know in the comments. Sorry this is a bit late. I've been a bit ill over the last few days, so any support for still pushing through and getting this video done would be much appreciated. Please do subscribe. Please do leave a like. Let me know your thoughts on this game, what you think is going to happen, and I'll see you guys after the Tottenham game.